Our panelists, you have speakers' bios, and I'm sure you're familiar with members of the panel. We'll get started with Ramon Torrent from the Universidad de Barcelona. Please.
Yes. Hello, good afternoon. I have prepared no PowerPoint presentation because Andres told me that I had to improvise according to what was discussed during the day. I don't like it because I have always said that the best improvisations are those well memorized. But I'm obedient and I'll try. The impact of the global economic crisis, a very positive one, at least in one respect. It has been pedagogical. And I'll try to summarize in 6 points, compressed in 15 minutes, the six lessons we can draw from the crisis, and I will make reference to what has been said today. First, Luth said that we had to rethink and think out of the box. Of course, this is the first lesson. But we have to rethink not only because of political failures, but because of analytical and academic mistakes. And we should be courageous and talk about mistakes. Mistakes not only, as I say, in political terms, but also in intellectual terms. We, the academy, we have thought wrongly and we have taught wrongly. This is clear in terms of economics. Most of the economics taught in the Faculty of Economics have proved wrong, and if we were serious, we should send it to the rubbish, but also in terms of regional integration. And I will simply quote 2 examples that have been extremely damaging in Latin America. Any expert in Latin America has in the back of its mind one of the silliest things ever written about regional integration, which is Bella Balassa's idea of the 5 stages of regional integration. If you have this in this mind, you are completely lost, because you are completely unable to think about regional integration. The second example is that everyone in Latin America seems to know that the customs union is a free trade area with a common external tariff. I'm sorry, this is not a customs union. This is a free trade zone with a common external tariff. A customs area is something completely different. I have had the experience in Mercosur, including the General Secretariat of Mercosur, in the General Secretariat of the Andean Community, and in America Central, of explaining what is a customs union, to the great surprise of everyone who was listening, who thought that a customs union was at the same time more and less that a real customs union is. This is very important because when we talk about inertia, Eric, and when we talk about this proliferation of agreements, inertia in the terms of agreements exists also, is the attitude of copy and paste. All these agreements are copy and paste, one from the other. And if we continue like this, this is a very bad way forward, so we have to recognize the mistakes. Second lesson, which is very important, and I don't like that it hasn't been mentioned until now today. We have discovered in the crisis that all this talking about the state being overcome by rampant globalization and becoming nearly powerless in a globalized economy has proven to be what it has been from the very beginning, a concoction from the right, oriented to delegitimize public policies and naively bought, as always, by the left in order to uncover their inability to think about adequate policies in a globalized economy. We have discovered now that there hasn't been in the history of mankind another so powerful economic machine as the modern state. we had forgotten to imagine what is the German state in Europe, the French state, the United States. And we have discovered that thanks to them, the crisis has not become a Great Depression as in the 30s. So please, let's forget in this thinking anew and thinking out of the box that the state is extremely powerful, with limitations, of course, but extremely powerful. The third lesson, and this is dedicated to one of the comments by Pablo in the last intervention, we have discovered what the GATT and by extension the WTO agreements are really about, which is not opening the spiral of liberalization, because there is no a single article in GATT that creates an obligation to liberalize, but they are about preventing the closing of the spiral of liberalization. This is what Article 2 is about, that forbids to close more than the bound concessions the spiral of liberalization, and gives this guarantee to all members of the system. And thanks to this has helped that the present crisis has not developed in a trade war as in the 30s. Do you imagine what would have happened in the world if the WTO had not existed and China had not been in it? Frankly, I am too European and I'm too conscious of two world wars invented by Europeans to even think in what would have happened. Do you imagine President Sarkozy without China and the WTO? Would have resisted to the temptation of giving all the fault of the French economic problems to Chinese exports? Thanks to the GATT and the WTO in general, this is no longer possible. This leads me to the fourth lesson. We have discovered that we have made in the last decade at least accumulation of mistakes. And I think that now, if we have to think out of the box, Luz, the first thing we should say is that launching the Doha round of negotiations in 2001 was an enormous mistake. It put all of us in a sort of impasse of a way that led nowhere except to giving with the head into the wall, and this was perfectly envisageable already in 2001. Paolo Giordano is the witness that in regional trade dialogue organized by the IDB in 2001 in the summer before Doha, I explained that the way forward was not further liberalization, but the 3 C's strategy: consolidation, completion, and coherence. If we had embarked in a strategy of consolidation, completion, and coherence in 2001, we would have been now in a much better situation than we are now. In particular, completion, not only with the entry of China, but also of Russia in the multilateral system, but completion in particular, completing, which is the missing leg of the international economic relations, which is the missing leg of capital movements and of regulation, yes, regulation on capital movements. The fifth lesson is that we have discovered that the main levels of economic policy continue to be the national and the multilateral. This is clear. The national for obvious reason, and the multilateral also, because it is at the multilateral level that the trade wars and blocks capitalism, the worst species of capitalism, are prevented. Bilateral and regional agreements, of course, play a role. I think, at least in theory, much more regional than bilateral. bilateral agreements, let's be clear, will begin to be serious in the global perspective when we'll see a bilateral between big and big. All the time that bilaterals are between a small and a small, or big and a small, are rather irrelevant for the world architecture. And this is a fact. And what has happened in APEC 10 days ago proves that the idea the people had that the stagnation in the Doha negotiation will lead to a proliferation of very meaningful, all this, I think, will not work any longer. The regional level, of course, has a place in the system, but a place provided it is well designed, well conceived, and well implemented. And this leads me to the sixth and final lesson to be drawn, is that we have discovered in these last 2 years that the European integration process is in a very bad shape. The European integration process played its role in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and probably, as I would be able to explain to you, but this would take much longer, in the 80s lost direction, even if it continues the inertia by the way of strategies by default and fuites en avant permanent, but lost direction and the advances have proven wrong. And in this direction, only 3 comments. First, and I will talk about empirical facts. First, the European Union as such has been completely unable to take one single measure against the crisis. Not a single one. All the measures have been taken by member states individually. All of them, without any exception. And if you know an exception, please tell to me. And this not only because of lack of political will, but because when the European and Monetary Union was invented in Maastricht, they forgot about the economic union. This was clear from the very beginning. But how many of academics in Latin America explained to their students that Maastricht was a very badly designed treaty? It was from the very beginning. It was completely contrary to the rapport de Delors. Nobody said so. Maastricht was heralded as a great step in integration. Yes, a great step in integration, but in the wrong direction. Second, never forget that the European Central Bank raised interest rates in July 2008. If the European Central Bank raised interest rates in July 2008, there are 4 explanations possible. Either first, they were sadistic, the second, they were irresponsible, the third, they were ignorant, the fourth, they had deep inferiority complex. I think that none of these 4 explanations is the right one. The right one is that it was bad design from the very beginning. It was not well conceived. It didn't have a period of learning by doing. From one day from the other, member states lost their monetary competence that was transferred to the European Central Bank without any period of transition that was envisaged, on the contrary, by the report de Delors, and that was the result. Third fact, very important for you in the discussions in Canada, if the discussions on the reform of the international financial architecture led to some kind of agreement with some kind of measure looking for control of short-term capital movements, what Brazil has just implemented, you would discover that this is contrary to the provisions of the European Community Treaty accordance to Maastricht, that liberalized completely, without any restrictions, and without any possibility of introducing permanent measures, movement of capitals with third countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramon, for those very stern comments. Barbara? Do you have it uploaded here? It's in the memory stick. Oh, okay.
Well, it's kind of daunting to go after a presentation like that. I have to say, I'm bringing you right back into the box because I couldn't follow up on that. And I have many pictures. A picture is worth 1,000 words, so I'm hoping to cut my part of the discussion so that we have some time to ask Dr. Torrent questions such as, yes, Doha might have been misconceived, but what do we do about it now? Probably we won't have time to get into fixing European integration. But I took my assignment from José Raúl quite literally, which is to do a comparison, to do a summary of main points for today and do a comparison, intra-regional comparison, looking at the crisis. And so we'll go through this rather quickly, the several points on how the crisis has impacted Latin America versus other regions, what Latin America has done differently now than in other crises, and leave with a number of questions based upon scenarios that we might expect for the future. So the LAC region has benefited from favorable external conditions, large demand from China and less compellingly India and other Asia-Pacific countries for primary commodities, and strong macroeconomic fundamentals, partly a learning process from reacting to other financial crises, and partly as a result of favorable external conditions. So we see here world GDP growth 2000 to 2009, and this just illustrates some of those favorable conditions. Of course, when we take the nosedive after 2008, it's no longer quite so favorable, but the buildup between 2003 and 2007 certainly set the stage for growth in Latin America, particularly the large primary export commodity countries. Commodity prices, we have energy, food, agriculture, and metals have also been obviously quite good for these countries. Latin America has also taken steps that have enabled them to take advantage and to implement counter-cyclical policies that have helped them to deal with the crisis. The fiscal balance, for the first time in recent memory in 2006 for the region as a whole, has been positive, and that has certainly helped countries be able to react to the crisis. International reserves have been robust, whether by policy design or by external circumstances. External debt has gone down considerably. Most countries have been managing external debt. There are obviously exceptions, countries in which debt is still a burden. So the Latin American region has been hard hit, but it is not the hardest hit region. Here is just a picture of the economic growth difference between 2009 and 2007 by geographic region, the CIS and Mongolia being the hardest hit Asian NICs. The really open and recently industrialized Asian countries have been the second hardest hit in terms of the difference between 2007 and 2009. And also in terms of the downturn in 2009, Central and Eastern Europe, and so Latin America is only the fourth hardest hit developing region. Oh, thank you. Latin America is the strong orange line, has done relatively well with regard to inflation. I seem to have missed my label on there, but Latin America tends to be orange in these slides. And then Latin America has also recovered relatively well in terms of equity markets. There was a strong downturn in 2008, but relative to Eastern Europe and Asia, equity markets are rebounding. In terms of the financial stress index, the point has been made that Latin American financial regimes have been relatively strong. There has been a strong uptick in the financial stress in 2008, but that's recovered relatively well. LAC has been hit relatively hard by the trade effects, second only to Asia. And this also underscores the heterogeneity in the responses and in the impact of the crisis. And this is a factor that has been mentioned many times. Countries that are more integrated into international markets and that are more open to trade have fared worse in terms of the drop in GDP and in terms of the difference between 2009 and 2007. Some countries have been hit harder than others. Countries that are relatively more integrated, countries that have relatively stronger trade relationships with the United States. We say Mexico obviously has been the hardest hit, Paraguay, Jamaica. But we also have countries that have done relatively well. Peru, which has diversified both in terms of, mostly in terms of geographic trade ties, has done relatively well. We see Guatemala, which we might have expected all the Central Americans to do poorly, but perhaps this was one of the non-implementers that Paulo was talking about earlier. There's a correlation between openness to trade and the impact of the economic crisis in Latin America. That's even more stronger in Asia, where the more open countries have been relatively hardest hit by the crisis. And the countries with trade and investment with the United States have done worst. Now, another factor is the composition of exports. Countries that are reliant on manufacturing trade have been harder hit than countries that have been benefiting from high commodities and fuel prices. Obviously, there's also a difference in the recovery in industrial production. Brazil took the heaviest hit in terms of a downturn in industrial production, but has recovered more strongly than Mexico and more strongly than Latin America as a whole. In terms of stock market indices, things looked quite bad. Countries that had really nothing to do with the crisis saw their stock market indices go down by more than 50%. There's some rebound there. And then what does this heterogeneity mean for the future? This probably also means that there will be a difference in terms of the way that countries perform going forward. And there could be, as a result, a shift in power, relative power, and a shift in relative economic relations also within the region. If we talk about concerns for the region as a whole, really it depends what types of scenarios we look at in terms of the recovery. If we have what I call a rose-colored recovery, which assumptions are that there's a V-shaped recovery in the United States, China and the Asia Pacific continue to do well, so continue to demand primary products from Latin America. We somehow complete Doha, and there's some sort of at least a symbolic success at the multilateral level that allows countries to continue some sort of discussion within the WTO, and there's no rampant protectionism. Then that will have some implications for integration. That's probably the, continue as you were before scenario, with not a lot of difference in terms of the performers. Mexico and the Central Americans can enjoy benefits from the recovery of the United States and Europe, and countries that are more reliant on Asia and the Pacific will also continue to have demand for their products. You also, however, that's probably a very rosy scenario. We could also see the stagnation scenario in which the U.S. stumbles along. We don't have a V-shaped recovery. We have more like a W or a V going into an L. The U.S. grows very slowly. China also begins to feel the heat. There's no go on Doha and creeping protectionism. Now, this is probably bad for regional integration. You could anticipate having intra-regional spats, trade spats at the multilateral level, and obviously political problems among the countries. You could also see a scenario, and in this case, and this is also not necessarily unrealistic, we don't really know what's happening in China. My colleagues who are experts on China assure me that things are not necessarily what the Chinese say they are, and so there might not be quite as much scope for increased demand in China. So that's something to keep in mind. In another scenario, we have the Asia rising scenario where the U.S. stumbles along, but Asia continues to increase in demand. And so the countries that are more tied towards the Asian economies do well. Countries like Mexico and Central America do poorly in both absolute and relative terms, and so that also enforces the changing balance of power in the region. A couple of concerns in any of these scenarios are, will countries be able to sustain fiscal stimulus if that is required? If we don't have the rose-colored recovery scenario in any of the other scenarios, that might become a compelling issue. Many of the Latin American countries that have accumulated reserves, that have had fiscal surpluses, that have done well in terms of not increasing their external debt, that have seen moderate inflation, whose inflation targeting policies have worked, have managed to do well. What happens when they run out of the resources that they've accumulated throughout the 2000s? I think this is a very real question. Another issue is what happens when countries are no longer able to sustain the anti-poverty policies that have really been helping people stay out of poverty. ECLAC tells us that just in this year, 9 million people in Latin America have already fallen into poverty as a result of the crisis. This has obvious implications for inequality, and we're talking about scenarios in terms of inequality at the personal level, but also greater inequality excuse me, among countries. And finally, what is the role for U.S. policy in the region? I think that this will have a great impact. Since we're in Washington, I'll take the view, maybe not from California, but from Washington, although I guess I'm an odd person to do that. But I do worry about what happens if the United States, I mean, we really haven't heard anything from the U.S. on Latin America trade. I think the biggest thing that you've heard from, other than nice rhetoric, is the possibility of kicking Brazil out of the GSP and some nice words about, and kicking Bolivia out of the Andean Trade Preference Program. And none of these signal really positive potential. Hopefully I'm wrong on this, and perhaps I'm just in a bad mood today, but hopefully that's not the case. But what happens if the United States doesn't pass Colombia and Panama, removes Brazil from the GSP, and this is policy towards Latin America? I mean, the United States turning its back on Latin America, I think, would reinforce some of these trends that are already causing countries to turn away from the United States, and I think that would be a problem for the U.S. in terms of its relationship with and influence in the region. So I think I'll stop there and just that open to the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll now hear from Ms. Bustillo from CEPAL, coming over here. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. José Raúl asked me to focus very briefly on the impact of the crisis on trade, on regional trade. I will do that briefly and then focus a little bit on the policy response and then looking forward. It has already been mentioned, of course, that this was a crisis that hit the region mostly through trade channels, but also in the case of some countries, through the remittances and tourism, commodity prices, and external demand. The impact in some cases will be quite hard, at least in 2009, and these are our estimates for the impact of the drop in foreign direct investment, remittances, commodity prices, and external demand. December 10th, we're releasing our estimate for growth, GDP growth in 2009, and we're estimating a drop in GDP growth for the region as a whole somewhere between 1.5, 1.9%, which is somewhat better than what we had projected some months ago. There has been a general trend as the months have gone by to a little bit more rosy scenario, mainly given what is going on Brazil. And as Barbara was saying, but still, for 2009, it's a very hard drop, and some countries will be very hard hit. And as Barbara was saying, in terms of social indicators, we released last week our poverty figures. There was an increase in 9 million poor people. But most importantly, the crisis came to break the sequence of very successful years in terms of past 6 years in terms of growth and poverty reduction. In the past 6 years, many countries have had the best successful economic performance in 40 years. And for the region as a whole, poverty declined between 2003 and 2008 by 40 million people. So it came to break a cycle, a very important cycle in the region. It was mentioned before by Luz Maria that the drop in exports still in 2009 will be quite brutal in the case of the region. We did not see a comparable drop in exports in Latin America and the Caribbean in 70 years. And in the case of imports, we have not seen a drop. We will not see a drop compared to the past 27 years. This is the figures. I'll leave this data, but all throughout the different sub-regional agreements, we see a significant drop in the value of exports. Exports to China have also dropped, but less than to other destinations, as seen in that graph. And then commodity prices are now rebounding, but I wanted to show intra-regional trade. Intra-regional trade has been hit, and intra-regional trade has not reached the levels that, even before the crisis, had not reached the levels that we had prior to the Asian crisis. And intra-regional trade is important because when we look at the composition of intra-regional trade versus other trade, we find that this intra-regional trade is more, let's say, small and medium enterprise friendly and adds a little bit more value than exports that trade with other regions. So this is something to take into account in terms of when we look forward and the value of maybe trying to foster a greater intra-regional trade. In 2009, in the first half of 2009, what I was saying before, intra-regional trade declined by close to 33%. Now, let me stop a little bit on the responses that we've seen in the region in regards to the crisis. Here I just focus on trade. I'm not talking about all the policy responses. We have been following those policy responses very carefully, and you'll find in our website a report that we update every month that has all the policy responses in different areas: monetary policy, financial policy, trade, labor, social policies, etc., in the Americas. And I would say that most of the countries have been reacted very soundly to the crisis. And of course, some countries had a greater fiscal capacity to respond. But even in the area of trade, I'm a little bit more optimistic than Pablo in terms of the policy responses. Some countries, yes, protectionism has increased in several countries. But when we look to the past 20, 30 years, the policy response has not been as protectionist as in previous crises, and not more so than in other regions of the world. When we look at the policy response, at least in the area of trade, to this current crisis in Latin America, it has been quite moderate. There have been some some restricting measures, but countries have used little use of the margin to raise tariffs, and also there have been some pro-trade responses. So overall, I would say that developed countries, when we compare the policy response, developed countries have reacted more drastically in some cases and more protectionist in some way than some of the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. So overall, it's, I think, and overall in terms of the policy response, both trade and in other areas, I think most of the countries and the region as a whole has avoided the reaction to some past crises, at least in the 1980s, where we reacted with some type of adjustment policies that had very negative impact on productivity, on investment, etc. I think we have avoided that type of policy response that compromised, at least when we look at the reaction in terms of the crisis of the 1980s and the Asian crisis, compromised productivity growth for many years. Now, in terms of looking forward and whether there are openings for regional cooperation, at ECLA we do believe that there are openings for regional cooperation, regional response, and that in fact some of the challenges that many of the countries of the region face demand an effort in a policy response that involves cooperation. And that is basically because when we look forward, and I go back to something that Paolo said in the morning, when we look forward, most estimates, whether it's IMF estimates, etc., when they look at projections for world growth, they say, well, most likely the world economy will start growing in 2010. But for the years 2010 and following years, most likely the rate of growth will be lower than in the previous years. That's sort of the so-called new normal that people are talking about. And also, as Paolo was saying, probably the export-led model will be, the payoff will be less than in previous years. So in that context, and adding to that the greater competition of China and the Asian economies, the greater demands of competitiveness, globalization, etc., the greatest challenge, or one of the greatest challenges that we see at ECLAC, is the challenge of productivity, the challenge of competitiveness, the challenge of adding more value to exports, of innovation, etc. And addressing those challenges, I think that the response at the sub-regional level or regional level, or some things that have to be, many things can be done together in terms of regional cooperation. And the areas that we have been focusing with governments and with the private sector are basically responses in these 7 areas: infrastructure, intra-regional trade, innovation, social cohesion, closer ties, and climate change. I'm not going to go into all the proposals that we have been discussing with member governments. We prepared a document that was in December of last year called a regional response to the crisis. And many of the proposals that are analyzed there are some proposals that are already underway. But the point is that we find that there's lots of space to cooperate at the sub-regional or regional level in areas that are not necessarily trade per se, but are trade related, and that there's room and there is opening to move forward. Particularly, let me just focus on the issue of innovation. That's something that we have been working in the past 2-3 years. We've been analyzing and doing lots of research of what can be done in the area of innovation. And there are several proposals, and countries are really doing some interesting work in the area of innovation. But one thing that has been interesting to us, we looked at the experiences of about 12 countries that had a bet on export-led growth, and countries that had made export promotion and integration into the world economy a priority. So those countries were outside of our region. They were very successful with an export-led strategy in terms of converging towards a level of higher levels of development. So many of those countries are natural resource-based countries, many of them medium-sized countries, similar to the levels size of Latin American countries. So we looked at what had made those, what elements were present in their success. And regardless of the different economic structure, regardless of the political system, etc. And what we found is that those 12, 13 countries that had been quite successful had some type of vision of where they wanted to go. And a vision that was much related to innovation, and a vision that accomplishing and moving forward demanded some type of public-private sector collaboration. And that's something also that we've been looking very carefully in Latin America to the public-private sector collaboration. And that's an area that also we think that is amenable for actions at the sub-regional and regional level. So let me finish with that. But I think I want to finish on an optimistic note. I think there are areas that countries are moving forward, and more could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ines. Thanks for a very swift panel. We open the floor to questions, comments, reactions from the audience. Pablo.
Just a clarification, because people is referring to me as was pessimistic. And now if international, I'm also international kind of people from the international bank, so I cannot be I had to be careful about what I say. So no, my point was that I was pessimistic that regional integration agreement as we have now, let's say Mercosur, CAN, etc., are the basis for finding ways of collaborations for a new financial infrastructure that help us to deal with this global crisis. In the sense that those are good things for trade and for maybe foreign direct investment, etc. And actually, as you said, Ines, I guess Mercosur, the counterfactual would be, what would be Argentinian tariff in the middle of this crisis if we don't have a Mercosur? Of course, much, much higher than actually the was. So, to me, Mercosur play a key role in this. So, I'm not pessimistic on that side. What I'm saying is we need more institutions. That's it. I mean, we need more institutions to find collaboration in these areas, regional institutions, regional banks, etc., and we need more of those.
Well, perhaps this perhaps has been said some way or another, but by some speakers before. But I think we must differentiate regional cooperation from regional integration agreements in formal. So there's a lot of scope for regional cooperation, but not necessarily tied with existing regional integration agreements, because in the areas mentioned by Ines, countries have a lot of room for cooperation, for instance, in climate change, but we don't need, that's not necessarily related to regional integration agreements. So perhaps this is a way to go forward, because we can we can separate this cooperation from the problems that existing agreements have. Perhaps we can advance without the burden of the existing conflicts.
I have a comment.
Yeah. For the most part, the Andean countries that form the ALBA have not been part of the conversation today. And I was wondering if people could comment a little bit on countries of the Andean region other than Peru, and to a lesser extent Chile. It's sort of southern cone and Andean at the same time. Because on the one hand, they have not entirely repudiated the Andean community. On the other hand, they are subject to a completely different logic. And I was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on the way the patterns that have been described throughout the day apply or don't apply to smaller economies like Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela sort of on its own, but even Colombia, whether you can speculate a little bit on that.
Ambassador Barbosa.
Well, a bit in the same line. I think that there is no political will today to advance in the integration process. Most of the countries are doing bilateral agreements, bilateral cooperation, bilateral integration, not the region. I don't think that the region now, I'm speaking mainly about South America, that there is a political will. I mean, the region with Venezuela and Bolivia is fragmented. I really don't see how we can speak on a positive note about integration at this stage, because there are political constraints. And in my view, there is no political will to take forward the process.
If we could start with some answers, and then we'll take a second round.
Yes, I have two comments. On Andean countries, which is not Peru, as I always try not to lose the sense of humor, I have had a glance to your presentation, and I have discovered that the two countries in Latin America that were facing better the crisis were Bolivia and Ecuador, at least according to the numbers. So
Bolivia and Peru. Sorry.
No, Ecuador. Bolivia and Ecuador. Have a look.
Ecuador está más o menos, ¿no?
Ecuador, Peru has lost 7.4.
Ah, sí. And
Ecuador, much less, and Bolivia, less. Bolivia, the best one. I don't believe in statistics, so but it's simply not to lose the sense of humor. More seriously, I was in Ecuador in June for a very particular consultancy of high level with the government for a week, and it was extremely interesting. What I heard there very often was full of common sense. To begin with, it was the government of Ecuador that has explained to everyone in the world that the solution to the issue of bananas had to be found in the WTO and not through the bilaterals. This is something that all the believers in the multilateral system must be grateful to the government of Ecuador, because it is thanks to him that he has blocked the maneuver of Costa Rica and Colombia on one side and people in Brussels on the other side of bringing this to the arena of bilaterals, and it has been kept in Geneva, and I think it has been kept in Geneva, according to the last news, with a reasonable chance of success. But I disagree with you, Andres, that one has to differentiate between regional cooperation and regional integration. This is artificial and is the result of the Latin American obsession in producing international law that then never enters into force or is permanently violated. I think that this is one of the mistakes and one of the ways of rethinking integration here in Latin America. Integration, that's why I hate Bela Balasas and all these kind of presentations, does not proceed unidirectionally. Has a lot of different paths that goes in different directions, stems from different premises, follows different objectives, and rules are only one of the instruments. Instead of being obsessed with rules, maybe it would have been better for Latin America to forget about a lot of rules and begin to do things together. If Central America, instead of talking so much about institutions and rules and copying the European model, had discovered the, how do you call it, Pablo, the Puebla-Panama corridor 50 years ago, I'm sure that regional integration in Central America wouldn't be worse than now. And this, for me, is important, because one of the comments I had, I didn't have time in my intervention before, on this morning, is that the problem is not institutions or dispute settlement. The problem is respecting or not respecting the law. And if you are unable to respect the law, then it is better to produce less law, less rules, and select them and make them more enforceable, and that they really serve to manage the reality. And this is important. And I will recall here something that I always recall in the Americas. Never forget that in the good old times, the good times of European integration, the European Court of Justice had known, and known means absolutely known, power of enforcement. So, if member states of the European Community fulfilled their obligations under community law, was because of a voluntary commitment to do so. There was no enforcement of the decisions of the court, and reprisals or retortions were completely prohibited. In other terms, what happened in the 70s if a German regulation was found contrary to the provisions of the European Community Treaty and Germany did not modify it? what would have happened? Nothing. Nothing means nothing. Absolutely nothing. And in Mexico, Luz, is there any effective mechanism of dispute settlement in NAFTA? No. But does NAFTA work? Yes. Why? Because it is NAFTA, and it is with the United States. And the problem here in Latin America, I think, and this is essential for the rethinking of integration, is that Latin American countries believe in the law they produce with others, but do not believe in the law they produce among themselves. But they continue to be obsessed with producing law. When I read the UNASUR agreement, what surprised me most is that in that agreement there was a mechanism of production of law, copied from that of Mercosur, because of this obsession. So I think, contrary, we should put together all forms of integration and cooperation and thinking about them together. That would be my idea.
No, just picking on what Ramon said about doing things together. And some of the areas that are things that are going on, by the way, it's not that there are things that countries are doing together. Some within the sub-regional integration system, for example, in Central America, there are very interesting things that they are doing together right now, as well as outside the scheme of the sub-regional integration system. So I guess maybe what can be done together, whether it's within the sub-region or just forms of cooperation, would be a way to view what's going on in the region.
Another example would be the European monetary system, to which Roberto has referred before, the old one, before monetary union, had nothing to do with the European community, absolutely nothing to do. There was not a single line of community law behind the European monetary system. It was simply a system, Pablo, you know it well, of agreements between central banks, in which central banks were all the same, but some were more the same than the others. And this worked reasonably well. And I think that these are the types of examples that could be useful for Latin America.
That's what I think that maybe in the past we thought that, let's say, Mercosur or CAN had to, cover everything. Maybe not. You can separate the things, and as you said, maybe between central banks, there's already a cooperation that is going on, that is very strong because of they have their incentive to do that and whatever. And maybe that could give place to a new institution which is separated from other institutions that have intrusion. So that's my point.
No, just a clarification. I don't know if we disagree. I was trying to say perhaps the same than you. They say if we try to put these new issues within the existing framework, for instance, of Mercosur, it is the best way to avoid progress, because the institutional structure of these agreements perhaps is like stunned. No, it's, you can't advance because there are a lot of problems accumulated, and so perhaps it is better to ignore the existing institutional structures of these agreements, which are mainly oriented to produce law. And this is it's perhaps illustrative of your argument that Mercosur last innovation is to create a parliament, and this is going to be built, but in the meantime, no advances are made in the real issues. So I agree. We must forget about these rules, but I think that this also means that you can go beyond the existing agreements in terms of who are the partners. So regional cooperation does not need to be restricted to the existing partners of each agreement.
Maria, and then I have a quick question.
2 seconds, just on dispute settlement. Well, fortunately, there have not been many cases under the dispute settlement of NAFTA, and Jose Luis Paz, the director of the Mexico Trade Office, can correct me if I'm wrong. But there have been the cases that have been settled under this dispute settlement mechanism have actually come to a final resolution, and I can think of two that have been favorable to Mexico, and not only in terms of retaliation, but also in terms of how they have impacted on changing policies in the U.S. I can also think of a case, the sugar case, in which the U.S. decided not to accept establishing a panel, and, well, just after 10 years, it was simply not pertinent anymore to establish a panel. But I do think that NAFTA has worked, but I also think that dispute settlement mechanisms sometimes make more enforceable responsibilities and obligations under free trade agreement. And in the case of Aladi, for example, there's no dispute settlement mechanism. So it's like, if we want to comply, that's fine, and if we don't, too bad.
Just have a quick question for Ines, taking here moderator's prerogative, and perhaps other members of the panel can comment. You mentioned something in the case of innovation. You mentioned a really interesting evidence of pointing the way forward for public-private cooperation. And this topic has emerged sometimes during the course of the day, for Luz Maria and others, talking about what the private sector thinks about some of these things. And so has the crisis and thinking in terms of regional integration changed the relationship that the private sector has towards these types of initiatives? And do you see the private sector role playing more of the lead in the cooperation, or in the achieving of some of the cooperation initiatives that we've been discussing later in the afternoon? In finance, even, for example.
Yeah. Before answering your question, in some of the countries that we studied, we found that precisely the public-private sector collaboration, etc., was in response to some type of crisis that took place in the country. And I'm talking about outside the region. Now, yes, I think definitely what we see in what we're seeing right now is, in some cases, yes, more interest in seeing how you could come together in terms of coming up with some type of consensus with respect to doing something. Yes, in several countries we're seeing that. I don't know if that's more than in previous cases, but it's something that we find that it's quite positive in the past months.
And you don't see it fitting in with the regional integration scheme. That's the question is, does it have taken place in spite of?
Not in spite of, no, but not necessarily related to. Yeah.
Okay. Paulo.
One thing that strikes me about all this conversation that we had is, if we come back to the framework that Roberto was presenting this morning about demand and supply of cooperation, we discuss a lot why the supply of cooperation doesn't work in Latin America. We say because we need the multiple velocities, we need the variable geometries, and we don't respect the rule of laws, and this is the real truth of the matter. And that's fine, but at the end of the day, what drives the process is really the demand, and where people are demanding cooperation. And it seems to me that Roberto put it quite clearly this morning. Trade intensity has grown up, but trade interdependence is still very low. And as we move forward, countries of the region look more, or people in the region, or private firms in the region, look more outside of the region than within the region. So the question, again, I think, and I make a living out of integration, so it's against my interests. The question is, are there interests in the region? Like, is there a real basis for a new demand of cooperation in the region? And this is what is not clear to me. And if I look around, maybe there is something. Now everybody talks about climate change and trade, climate change and cooperation. Apparently this is the big thing everybody talks about, but is it enough? Because we discussed the crisis, it doesn't seem that this is enough. The region is not in big pain and doesn't need each other. They don't really need each other to get out of the crisis. And if we look at Europe, really, what was the origin that sparked the process of integration was the fear of war. Never again something as the generation previous of ours have seen. So I think this is perhaps, where is the demand? Or what could be the event that would trigger some heightened demand? Maybe this is the question for the next seminar.
Okay, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panel for wonderful presentations. If you want to conclude...
Just, to thank Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this meeting with us and be the host of this very interesting event. And I hope that we can continue this collaboration with you. And thank you very much to all the speakers and participants. And, well, that's all.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to make one final comment, too, to thank all of the presenters, especially those that have traveled from far away to join us for this seminar. I think all of us are a little surprised that it's been more of a conversation among the researchers than something that has brought in outsiders, and I think maybe we will have learned our lesson about Thanksgiving week, which is already a short week, which makes it, I think more possible for all of us to free up the time, certainly those of us in the United States, but perhaps more difficult to get people to leave their desks. That said, the entire event has been videotaped, and we will be able to put the videotape up on the web for massive, a massive audience all over the hemisphere. And Andres and Jose will also be editing a publication containing a number of expanded papers based on today's presentations. So I wanted to thank you again. I think the level of discussion was truly outstanding, and I very much appreciate your being here.